Hi, this is Kim Logan, the Senior Project Manager and Ecological Team Lead for GEM Services, Inc. I'm here today to talk to you about excess soils and the new Ontario Regulation 40619 and what that all means for your construction sites. The presentation is going to cover soil construction contamination and excess soil, so how your soil is contaminated on site after those pre-existing conditions. I'm going to move into Ontario Regulation 40619, the changes that are in place now and the ones that are coming down the pipeline. That will lead into a flow chart that we've created to help lead you through your project. And finally, we'll close out going over some of those points that provide value based on the new regulation in place. So to start off, soil construction contamination, there's sources that can happen after once your construction project is started. So it's great that we have those reports in place and know what the existing conditions are, but we need to be aware of the other sources after the fact. So some of these include storage of construction materials on site, whether that be fencing, pumps, pipes, hoses, what have you. Staging areas, including where you do your fueling, as well as any repairs on machinery, even just parking the machines overnight or over the weekend. Other construction materials, including the actual concrete, so stormwater, culverts, anything that would have concrete material can add contamination to your site, as well as any lubricants or gasoline, whatever you might be using on your equipment for repairs or fueling. Improper handling or mixing of soils on site. So if you have some contaminated and some clean and they happen to get mixed together, that can create larger issues that you then need to deal with. Unanticipated soil conditions, sometimes we find things that were not investigated just due to the limitations of underground investigation. So we may uncover some bricks or other buried materials that can have impacts on your soils. If we're working on sewer and water main projects, there is always a potential for leakage from those pipes or underground utilities. Roads, we're all aware of EC and SAR. Those are big ones when it comes to de-icing on our major roadways. Garbage, another possibility. So when you're on site, those Tim Hortons cups, anything that's blowing in from outside sites or outside roadways. And then also we have some sites that are not possible to keep trespassers out. So anybody walking by outside of construction hours has the opportunity to get in and create contamination on your site. So sampling your sites before construction or during construction allows you to know the soil quality and if it meets the reuse criteria or if it needs to be considered as waste for disposal. So any soil that does not meet table 2.1 or better, that's going to be considered waste material and would need to be sent to an off-site disposal. Anything that is 2.1 or table 1, then that can be reused on site. Again, if any soil is considered a waste, then we know there are impacts from trucking and other restrictions that are coming out for disposal and trucking requirements. So just a quick timeline showing here what those regulatory changes and how the ministry is phasing the regulation in. Municipalities do have the option of carrying the full regulation all at once. The ministry says that it needs to meet at a minimum. So there is nothing stopping anybody from pushing all of it all at once. Because you are going to need to start doing it a lot of this next year, it doesn't hurt to start getting in the practice of it now. So for each of these timelines, I'll get into more detail on the next slides. Okay, so as of January 1st this year, the excess soil not considered a waste anymore if it's beneficially reused with consent on or off of a project area. It needs to be dry and remain dry. It also needs to meet those quality and quantity criteria that are laid out in the tables of the new regulation. The other new change that came out January 1st this year is the requirement for ECAs has been removed for certain conditions. So if you're hauling excess soil, whether it be dry or liquid, and it meets the transport and safety requirements, you just need to make sure that you have your quality and quantity information available. That means the truck driver can be asked to provide that information. Any low-risk on-site soil processing that you're doing, whether it be passive dewatering, mixing of soils, sorting soil and debris, if you're putting additives in to solidify for transportation, that level of activity does not require an ECA. But again, you're going to want to make sure that you double check on what you're doing as far as mixing soils, because it doesn't cover all mixing. So it's good to have your QP look into that when you have your project scope in place. If you are moving up to 10,000 cubic meters to a temporary soil storage site, you do not require an ECA. And any public bodies or infrastructure projects that are happening are able to use site-specific standards, and that material on those projects doesn't have to be reused right away. You have up to 2 years to reuse it. So if you're doing a large infrastructure project, you have the ability to keep working with that soil without having an ECA, and you have 2 years to move that soil around. It doesn't have to happen right away. So next year, January 2022, the ministry is going to put into effect the load tracking and inspection requirement. So any site that's accepting over 10,000 cubic meters needs to use a digital tracking system. There are going to be routine inspections to ensure that what is leaving a site and coming to a receiving site meets those requirements. There's new planning requirements being put in place for projects that generate 2,000 cubic meters of material within settlement areas, as well as sites that have greater potential for contaminated soil. So that includes registration on the public registry when you have removed excess soil from your project area, soil quality classification and destination assessments with those associated reports need to be completed by a qualified person. Those also need to be filed onto the site with all the other information, and your tracking system is implemented under those new planning requirements. There are exemptions, however, so some infrastructure projects and emergency projects where it's 100 cubic meters of soil or less can be moved directly to a waste disposal site, and they don't need to follow those new changes coming out in 2022. Another exemption is for topsoil reuse, but that needs to be defined in the Municipality Act. Also, excess soil that has no contaminants from sensitive sites are exempt from the new planning requirements as well. And the final phase in of the regulation comes in January 2025. And that is when soil that is clean enough for reuse is no longer permitted to be sent to the landfill as waste unless it's being used for landfilling operational needs. So whether that be a cover cap at the end or if they require soil for any of their maintenance activities on site. Finally, of the regulation is the grandfather clause, and this one we find there's a little bit of confusion on, just interpreting what that actually means. Contracts entered prior to January 1st, 2021 do not trigger the planning requirements. So those are the things that are coming out next year in 2022, and they do not need to file on the registry until January 1st, 2026. However, they will need to register. They just get that extra year. But the grandfather clause does not include projects on the excess soil side. So those first things that came into play January 1st, as far as if a soil is clean enough to be reused on site, it must be reused on site and considered excess soil. That comes into January 1st. There is no grandfather clause on that. So any of your construction projects that have started this year or you've entered into new contracts, the regulation does apply to you and you cannot get out of it. The only part you can get out of is any of those registration requirements that would come into play next year. So here's a quick visual overview of your project path. In the next 2 slides, I'll go through them in detail as to how you can navigate through the new regulation and how that's impacting your construction sites. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is, do I need to excavate? If you don't need to excavate, then the excess soils regulation is not applicable for your site. If, however, you do need to excavate, and I'm sure most of your projects are going to include excavation, you need to determine if you can reuse that soil on site or not. If you determine that you can reuse it on site, then you're going to require some confirmatory sampling. If you cannot reuse it on site, you need to figure out where that's going to go. So once you've chosen your receiver site, then you determine if they need confirmatory sampling or not. What has already been done may be acceptable for that site. If it is not acceptable, then you need to determine what your soil quality is. In order to determine your soil quality, you're going to need someone to come to site to take those samples. So that information needs to be collected under supervision of a qualified person. So when they take those samples, they're going to be submitted to a lab. Analysis is going to happen, and they're going to determine, based on that, what standards are met or exceeded. Now, if all of the standards have been exceeded, then right away we know it's waste. It's hauled off site and disposed of. However, if only some of the standards are exceeded, then there is potential to arrange and haul some of that material to an appropriate receiving site. There is also the possibility that the soil cannot be classified under the receiving site requirements. If that happens, there is a tool that can be used. It's the Beneficial Reuse Assessment Tool, otherwise known as BRAT, and that's something that your QP would be able to use to determine what arrangements need to be made and what receiving site it would need to go to at that point. There are definitely some good things that are going to come out of the new regulation. The nice thing is the majority of the liability is going to fall on the soil owners. The unfortunate part of that is it's not clear if owners are going to be delegating that ownership of soil and pushing the liability onto the contractors. We have seen that it's happening already in some cases. Not sure how that's going to continue to play out as the regulation moves forward, but definitely there's a lot of opportunity there for soil owners to take on more liability. Contractors are at the discretion of the owner's QP and the receiver's QP, the way the regulation's written, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the opportunity to retain your own QP to make sure that someone is looking out for your best interests and not just the owner or the source site and the receiver site. The nice thing about the soil tracking, you're already doing it on paper copies. It's going to be a lot easier on the digital side, and better soil tracking is going to provide that clear path on responsibility and make sure that liability falls on the appropriate people dealing with the soil as it moves from one site to another. There's also a lot more flexibility for you. So sourcing your backfill material may not be as big of a task as it has been in the past. If you have soil on site that can be reused and your tender documents and contracts allow you to use that as backfill material, then you don't need to bring any in. So that being said, you're talking about reduction in costs for any importing of soil. Anything you're reusing on site doesn't need to be exported. So you're saving tipping fee costs if you don't need to send it to a waste site and you can reuse it. The nice thing on the QP side is the risk does get put onto the QP, taking it off of the contractors. So if you have your own QP, the liability falls on them. You do have the opportunity to push back on the owner if that isn't pushed onto the contractor. But if you have the owner's QP and the receiver's QP, you can push back and make sure the risk is on them and not on you. So I just want to say thank you for listening to the presentation. I appreciate the opportunities to speak with you and to hopefully put some clarity on the situation. There's definitely a lot to navigate through the new regulation, a lot to understand. That is why there are QPs out there. Hopefully you have people you can rely on, people you can ask those questions, and you shouldn't have to navigate through that process. You aren't the QP. A basic understanding is really all you need, and then you have people out there that you can rely on to ask the questions. I know that the committee is open and accepting of all the questions that you have. They're very well versed in the information and can answer a lot of those questions that you have. If you have any questions specifically for me, my email address is on the slide here. Feel free to reach out anytime. We're always there to provide advice, and the association as well is always there for you. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the AGM.